all asked such a lot of excellent hostile questions that I've decided to split this video into two. Also because the weather has changed and I'm not putting that silk dress back on because it's bloody cold. So I am back answering more hostile questions of the type that I expect journalists might at some point ask me in an interview. So far everyone's been lovely, but I know my luck will change at some point, so I wanted some practice. So you very kindly obliged by sending me your hostile questions, which most of you of course do not agree with. You were just role-playing with me being cruel journalists, so thank you for that. So let us continue. Since sex work is aimed at fulfilling the male fantasy of using women as sexual objects, how do you feel about your work dragging real feminism down? To begin with, I would say I don't think all sex work is about fulfilling the male fantasy of using women as sexual objects, because clearly, for example, the massive femdom genre seems to be primarily about fulfilling the male fantasy of women using men as sexual objects. Now, of course, it's still largely a male fantasy. I think a lot of the femdom porn is primarily for consumption by men, but that's the absolute opposite of depicting women as sexual objects. I mean, you could argue that the women still are being, in reality, sexual objects because they're performing in porn, but the fantasy is about them appearing to be doing exactly what the hell they want to these submissive men. So I guess that's something I wanted to just say straight off the bat. But also, I think it's really interesting that I might have expected men consuming porn to view us as kind of two-dimensional sexual objects. But the reality has been rather the opposite, because what I have seen a lot of is men very much wanting to get a sense of who the person behind the porn is. So for example, when people order custom videos from me, they often want reassurance that I enjoyed the video that I shot for them. Sometimes they ask questions that I don't want to answer about whether I found their personal fantasy hot. And although that might be inconvenient for me, that might be boundary pushing that I'm not comfortable with, the fact that they are doing that boundary pushing suggests to me that they don't want performers to just be doing what they want without any emotional engagement. Actually, it seems like they would quite often very much prefer to be able to believe that the performer is getting something out of it too, which, however inconvenient that might be for my boundaries, it does suggest to me that men often are looking for a level of reciprocation when they engage with their sexual identities. And it makes me quite sad for them that porn can't really fully provide that. You know, only a relationship can probably fully provide that, but it seems quite a positive thing that at least porn and sex work is there to give lonely men some degree of sexual interaction. And that's not to say that porn is only consumed by lonely men, because it clearly isn't. But I think particularly the men who are lonely are looking for something beyond just tits on a screen. That has been my experience, and I have to say, again, anecdotally, but I know such a large number of models and have done over such a long period of time, that the fact that we get stalkers, awful though it is, suggests to me that, again, there are a whole load of men who do not want a two-dimensional sex object. Unfortunately, the type of man who is prone to stalking wants the absolute opposite. They want to know where you live, and they want to know what you eat for breakfast and who your friends are. And that is not an ideal situation, but it certainly points to the absolute opposite of men just wanting to look at two-dimensional sex objects and then forget about us. Sometimes it would be better for us if they did do that. Regarding dragging real feminism down, that is certainly something I take quite seriously, but I'm of the opinion that the only kind of feminism that really works is the sort of feminism that works for all women. So the type of feminism that tends to tell women what to do and what sort of woman is the right kind of woman, I don't think it serves all women. So the kind of feminism I like is what I consider to be libertarian feminism, where I am on the side of rights and opportunities for all women, irrespective of what they choose to do with that. However, I certainly do worry about the possibility that my creative output and the creative output of pornographers like me might give people watching it, the idea that women are constantly, multiply orgasmic, super highly sexed, into everything, always bisexual and loving cock, a sort of amalgam of all things that men might find convenient. So I just make sure that I balance my pornographic content out with real life stuff on my social media, so that people can see that even a professional pornographer who is obviously keen enough on sex to do that kind of thing on camera has a life behind the scenes that doesn't just involve loads of sex with loads of people all the time. I don't want to be self-aggrandizing here. This is not a unique thing that I do. A lot of successful models do the same thing, and I imagine it is quite often from the same instinct that we don't want to be seen as two-dimensional because it doesn't serve our needs, and the customers by and large don't seem to require that. Like, good customers often seem to respond really well to posts about our normal lives, which I always find quite a reassuring thing to see, because it suggests to me that they see us as human, as of course we are. Doesn't BDSM desensitize people to violence and reinforce old harmful gender roles? I feel like I might be a bit of a stuck record on this, but BDSM, if you look at it as a genre on the internet, it depicts multiple gender roles. Dominant women, dominant men, female submissives, male submissives, everything else. If you had managed somehow to only become aware of male dom / female sub porn, I guess it could appear to reinforce gender stereotypes, but I don't know how you could use the internet in this day and age and not stumble over the opposite of what you're looking to see, because I do it all the time. Personally, I have a really strong negative reaction to male sub, female dom BDSM porn, because it's just the opposite of my orientation and I see it all the time. So I do not accept that argument. BDSM sometimes reinforces old gender stereotypes, and it sometimes flips those gender stereotypes on their head. It just does whatever the producers / the performers / the audience think is hot, and that is a very wide variety of behaviour. So I don't think I've said anything really controversial or remarkable there, but perhaps a more unusual point that is perhaps a little more controversial is that I have to say my own experience of doing BDSM has actually somewhat increased my understanding of and sensitivity to violence, and I'll explain what I mean. I'm not trying to conflate what I do in BDSM scenes with non-consensual violence, but the fact is that if you've been tied down and caned hard, for example, even though you loved it, and even though it was in a consensual environment with someone you wanted to do that with, I think it's inevitable, if you are in any way an empathetic human being, that then if you read about something like that happening in a non-consensual environment, like judicial caning that still happens in some countries, or some sorts of torture methods, when I read accounts like that, I can't help but understand that on a better level than I did before. Because I remember before I'd done any of this BDSM stuff, I remember thinking maybe caning didn't hurt that much. If they did it in schools to children, maybe it wasn't that bad. And then I did some caning scenes and I realised it's really bad. It's really painful. And the idea of that being done to school children appalls me even more than it did before I'd experienced it, because I don't know what it's like to be caned non-consensually. But even having done something in a consensual environment that is somewhat similar physically to what used to be done in schools and prisons, it can't help but make you understand better how just abysmal and terrifying that would be. And that's had quite a profound effect on me through the years. The more experience I've got in BDSM. Recently, when I was in Germany, I went to Dachau concentration camp to look around it, and there was a description of one of the punishments that was used there, and it was to hang prisoners upside down for an extended period of time. Now, I don't know if someone who's never done BDSM would necessarily have much of an idea of what that's like, but I have been suspended upside down in a consensual environment, and it happened to give me just absolutely blinding pain in my head from like 20 seconds in. And that might not be the same for everyone, but reading that account that I saw at Dachau, I think my response to it was more sensitive than if I hadn't experienced something similar but in a consensual environment. My understanding of just how horrific that would be is better. I absolutely don't agree with the desensitization argument, and actually the one charity I've supported through my whole adult life, even when I was really poor and couldn't afford direct debits, was Amnesty International, because I always felt, even before I'd actually done any BDSM, extra sensitive to the idea, to what it would be like to experience violence when you hadn't got any way of stopping it. If other kinky people are watching this, I would be really interested to know what your response to seeing depictions of violence that are somewhat visually similar to some of the activities you might do yourself in consensual BDSM, because I might be unusual, but it feels unlikely, because it just seems like if you're a decent person, how can you not be more affected by depictions of activities that you have some understanding of? It seems to me that it would be inevitable. So let me know. Have you ever tried therapy to help you overcome your desire for someone to hurt you? Well, that suggests it's something I'd want to get rid of, and I do not. It's one of the best things in my life. But the fact is that conversion therapy doesn't work. We've seen that with the attempts from various homophobic organisations to put teenagers and adults through conversion therapy to turn them straight, and clearly therapy cannot take away your sexual identity, and quite right to, so no. Given the apparent rise in rape culture, do you not feel that creating work depicting non-consensual situations is sending the wrong message? Wow, I looked into this because I wasn't sure that rape culture is on the rise. So I looked up crime rates over the last 100 years with the expectation that I was going to find what I had been told I would find, which was that violent crime rates had dropped over the last 100 years. And they do seem to have. That is true. So as the availability of porn has increased over the last 100 years, violent crime rates have decreased. There's not necessarily a correlation there, because a whole load of other things have obviously changed in 100 years, so I'm not going to give pornography the credit just out of hand like that. But reporting of rape has changed so much over that period that it's really hard to get a clear reading on what's going on, because 100 years ago in this country marital rape didn't exist, so you wouldn't have reported what we would now call any kind of intimate partner violence or sexual assault from within a relationship. It wouldn't be in the crime statistics because it wasn't a crime. So reporting of rape has gone up in the last few years, but I didn't find any of the people behind any of the studies about this saying that they thought that incidences of rape had risen. So some data does seem to show that rates of rape in the population have gone up, specifically during the COVID pandemic. Again, I don't think there's a correlation between availability of porn and that, but it made me aware for the first time in my life of just how dizzying the amount of data on this kind of stuff is, and just how hard it is to isolate one possible cause from another. Because, you know, in the last 100 years, many more people are driving cars. There is more porn, there are more cars, there are more televisions. I'm glad I'm not a social scientist, because I felt really overwhelmed by looking up all this stuff. So, I do not accept the idea of a rise in rape culture, because at least amongst the population of women, there is less tolerance than ever before of rape and sexual assault. I think that much is clear, and I think I can say that confidently, at least in the West. So it seems unlikely to me that at the same time men are becoming more and more confident about raping, because, like, why would they when women are becoming more and more likely to report them? But do I worry that my work, which sometimes depicts non-consensual scenarios, could send the wrong message? And the answer is yes, I do. So any non-consensual scenarios that I film, I think it's important to frame them carefully so people know that they aren't actually watching a non-consenting model who's been surprised by a producer tying her up when she wasn't expecting it. So for example, if I see a producer who writes stories on his website like, oh, Ariel Anderson turned up to her shoot late, what a slut, so I tied her up and spanked her, you know, I wouldn't be working with that producer, because in those situations I think they've not framed this as a consensual activity. They framed this as though I, the real person, have turned up late and have been punished by them non-consensually, and I'm not okay with that. Whereas if they wrote, Ariel Anderson plays a estate agent captured by a rival estate agent that is tied up and spanked, that's totally fine, because they are framing it as a fictional scenario played out by actors. And I do sometimes feel a bit resentful that mainstream cinema doesn't have to worry about this. But I guess the fact is that if you see Jennifer Lawrence tied up and screaming in a movie, because she's a famous actress, you know it's not real, because you know that she was at Cannes Film Festival promoting this film 6 months later. Whereas, because most of us are not famous, you could potentially see a video of us online and not be sure that it was a consensual scenario. I mean, I think that's a bit far-fetched, but it is possible. So as a result, I do think we perhaps as fetish producers and pornographers do have a bit more of a burden of responsibility to just make it as clear as is possible that our work is not actually in a non-consensual environment. I mean, it doesn't seem fair to put that burden on fetish producers since it's not shared by mainstream producers, but why not go the extra distance to just make sure no one misunderstands? And personally, I have to say, I wouldn't be comfortable if all my creative output depicted non-consensual scenarios. Personally, I do feel more comfortable telling a range of stories so that my body of work as a whole isn't all about women forced into sex acts against their will. That is true, and I think there are a lot more ways of telling bondage and spanking stories than relying on fully non-consensual storylines. And yeah, it feels a bit more responsible if you don't only do that. But I don't think that's really fair. I think that is me being a bit overcautious. But like, why not be overcautious? How much extra do you charge for a sex act? Well, personally, there aren't a whole load of sex acts I do on camera, but the way I see it is that I should only charge more if there is an impact on my body from doing that act. So for me, really tough bondage that's going to leave bruises, or hard spanking with implements that's going to leave bruises or cane marks, or vaginal penetration which is likely to bruise me. Those are things I charge more for, because if I do that on one day, I probably won't be able to shoot the same activity the next day. In fact, I'd probably want to give myself a week before I shot more of that. So it feels like there's an opportunity cost to me, so I charge a bit more, and that's all. What would your grandma say about you being a sex worker? Well, sadly, I lost all my grandparents a long time ago, but I have to say the grandmother who was alive for the longest was totally okay with my cousin being a sex worker, so I guess she probably would have been okay with me being one. I mean, she probably knew I was. She never mentioned it. She seemed fine. How can you embarrass your family like this? I always find this so interesting because it assumes I'm the most embarrassing person in my family. And I have to say, sometimes I'm the embarrassed member of my family, because it's not like I come from a family of people who only do normal things and only behave in normal ways. How do you expect anyone to take you seriously professionally when you are known to behave this way privately? Well, I would certainly argue that, given my profession, I think I behave in the perfect way to be taken seriously in this job. If I was a BDSM model who didn't put out much evidence of doing BDSM, I think it would be very hard to be taken seriously. So, given that I am a BDSM model, having a Twitter feed and a YouTube channel in which I talk about these things and demonstrate these things seems like impeccable professional behaviour in this context. And no one knows how I behave privately. I mean, I'm sure people who know me well can guess that probably my private life is pretty kinky and pretty sexy, but the fact is it's private, so nobody actually knows. Now, almost all of these questions were asked by people who I at least somewhat know, and I was aware that they were playing devil's advocate. They were not asking questions through actual disapproval. But one question did come from someone who actually genuinely believes what I'm about to write. And he wasn't abusive about it, so I'm not angry with him or anything, but this was his sincere opinion and question. So I left it till last because in some ways it's the most important, because this is the only question I've got that someone seemed actually troubled by. Sex is such an intimate act that it can't be compared to other work activities, whereas the customers of other services are entitled to legally complain if a provider refuses to do their job. Sex workers can arbitrarily refuse to have sex with a client precisely because sex is such a private thing. To begin with, I'd have to say that sex clearly is many different things to many people. So for me, actual penetrative sex feels like an intimate act and that I do not want to do for work. That's true. But spanking, which is also a sexual act for me, is something I'm very happy to do on camera. It doesn't feel too intimate for me to do that at work. I'm very comfortable with it and I always have been. So that suggests to me that different people just have very different thresholds for what they find intimate. And I'm assuming that a full-service sex worker doesn't find penetrative sex the most intimate thing they can possibly do. They probably have other things that they wouldn't do with a client that for them are sacred and are intimate, but it could be something that is completely non-sexual. So, to begin with, I think that this question starts off with a misconception. Sex might be an intimate act for you, but it may well not be such an intimate act for the person you're watching doing it on screen. Or they may be capable of seeing it as an intimate act when they do it off screen with their partner, but not seeing it as intimate when they're doing it at work. Just like I guess cooking a meal could feel very different when you do it as part of a romantic evening as if you're a professional chef. But the thing that really troubles me about this question is that it's not true. If you compare sex workers with salaried employees of large companies, that might be true. Like, I have never worked for a large company, but I guess if I worked for British Telecom, for example, and I was on customer service, maybe I wouldn't be allowed to say, okay, well, I don't want to deal with this customer. But it's not fair to compare a sex worker to an employee of a large company because sex workers are self-employed. So to be fair, we'd have to compare sex workers to self-employed contractors like plumbers or personal trainers or dietitians or psychotherapists or lawyers or publicists. And people in those professions do turn down work if they don't want to do it. They do turn down individual clients. So, compared to those contractors, sex workers are in the exact same situation. Plumbers can turn down jobs they don't want, either because they don't like the customer or because they don't think they do a good job, or there are access issues, or the job is out of their geographical area. This is a very normal thing. And not only is it a very normal thing, it's a very good thing. So I sensed in this question the idea that the person who wrote it thought it was a bit below the belt that sex workers should be allowed to turn down clients. But escorts, for example, experience very high rates of violence and they are consequently very careful about who they end up alone with. It seems to me from the outside, looking at the way escorts that I follow on social media conduct themselves, it's like they are as careful as they can possibly afford to be. And as they get more successful, the first thing they seem to do is to put in extra safety protocols, extra screening. It seems to be the first thing they invest in, and I assume that's because they know that their job currently comes with some additional risks that they try to manage. So I would guess that for escorts, for example, because I think this man is talking specifically about escorts at a guess, I think that the reason escorts do turn down clients, maybe relatively often, is not because sex is such an intimate act, it's because they are in danger in a way that a lot of people who go to work aren't. So I think it's an excellent thing that escorts are empowered to turn down clients who they get a bad feeling about. Certainly in my experience as a professional model who's been working for 20 years, it's been absolutely vital that I've been able to turn down shoots with people if I've got vibes that have made me feel unsafe. And I am very happy to think that personal trainers, who are going to be alone with their client quite often, feel empowered to do the same thing. And I think, again, I'm on shaky ground here because I've never had a permanent job for a big company, but from talking to friends who do work for big companies, it sounds as though even in those situations, if for example you've had a customer who's been abusive to you on the phone, actually quite often you would be allowed to deny service to that customer and your manager would probably assign their case to someone else, because even if you work for a big company, if that company is anything like decent, they do take responsibility for their customers. So in short, I think sex work can absolutely be compared to other work activities. It's just, to be fair, you should compare it to self-employed activities rather than employment for a large company, because that is the fair equivalence. So that is my answer. Those are my answers. I would love to hear your answers, especially if you are a sex worker or into BDSM or both. So please do comment below. Thank you as always for watching. I will be back with more next month. In the meantime, have a wonderful month, and it is goodbye from me. Thank you. Goodbye now. Goodbye.